One.
Hello, Rabbi.
Hi. Hi, John. Hi, Stephen, Jeff, Kent. Good afternoon. I'm just going to set up here on the screen and I'll share it in a moment. We can get started. Okay. So we've moved into a new section. Yesterday, I think there was, I'm not sure what happened with the shir, but I know Rabbi Bacher is unfortunately sitting Shiva for his late mother. So he's obviously preoccupied. I'm not sure we managed to get a substitute. But yesterday we began a new section, which is the laws of Shechita, which is ritual slaughter. And we learned the basic rules of shechting. And today we're going to talk about some further details which relates to the places where one may or may not shecht, just for regular consumption, and what an intention might be during shechita, during the process of the ritual slaughter, and how exactly you do this. Now, I'm not a shochet, but I have witnessed it a couple of times. So I think today's chapter is simple enough. Some of the other laws might get a bit more complex, but today we should be able to all get through it. Let me share the screen. And we can begin learning. So here you have it, chapter 2, Shechita. Again, I'm just looking to the side because I have the notes on this other screen. Okay, so he says, a person can shech. This means that if you're slaughtering an animal to eat, you can do this anywhere, as long as you don't do it on a temple courtyard. For only animals consecrated for sacrifice on the altar may be sacrificed in the temple courtyard. Ordinary animals, by contrast, now when he says ordinary animals, that means meat that you're going to be slaughtering for your own consumption. Now, whether it's a domesticated animal, whether it's a wild animal or fowl. Now, I suppose what's interesting here is chaya, which were never used as sacrifice, but nonetheless, it's forbidden to sacrifice those in the temple courtyard. Similarly, it states with regard to meat which a person desires to eat, meat which, this is the phrase that the pasuk uses to describe meat that just for general consumption. So it says about that, when the place that Hashem will choose will be distant from you, and you shall slaughter from your cattle and your sheep, and you shall eat it in your gates, which we interpret la halacha to mean is that you can only slaughter it and eat it in your gates, and we infer that meat, we may infer that meat which man desires to eat may be slaughtered only outside the place that Hashem will choose. In other words, the slaughtering in the temple courtyard is for those things that are going to be brought as sacrifices. It has a sanctity. Slaughtering your cow that you're going to make into your hamburger or whatever, or put on your bra, you don't shecht in that holy place. Meat from animals slaughtered outside this holy place is permitted to be eaten everywhere. If everyone slaughters an ordinary animal in the temple courtyard, this meat is ritually pure, but it's forbidden to benefit from it. So this is what the halacha is saying, basically, that you're not allowed to shecht your lunch in the Beit HaMikdash courtyard. If you did, it's not ritually impure. In other words, the actual process of shechita is considered to be kosher. Something that was shechted incorrectly is an avela. It has ritual impurity. So he's making on the point that it's not ritually impure. However, it's forbidden even to benefit from it. Not only aren't you allowed to eat it, but you're not allowed to even have benefit from it. And in a similar way in which a mixture of milk and meat is forbidden from benefit. And therefore it must be buried. And if it's burnt, its ashes are forbidden to be used. He says the Bible applies even if one slaughters for healing purposes, to feed a non-Jew, or to feed dogs. It doesn't matter what your intention was. If you're slaughtering inside the Azara, even if it's a kosher slaughter process, it's ritually pure but completely forbidden from your benefit. If one cuts off an animal's head in the temple courtyard, one rips the signs from their place. The signs here he's referring to, we learned yesterday, that in order for shechita to be considered kosher, the so-called signs are the gullet and the wooden pipe. Those are the two essential, pipes in the neck of the animal. They must be severed, at least the majority of each of those pipes, in order for it to be kosher. So he says if somebody rips those out, and in other words, that would be an unkosher process of killing an animal, that animal is a nevela, it's non-kosher. So in all these situations, or if a non-Jew slaughters it, or if you slaughter it kosher, but you found that the animal is treif, basically you have to do an internal check, and details of which we'll learn, to see if the animal was internally healthy. If not, it's treif. Or if one slaughters a non-kosher domesticated animal, or a beast, a wild animal, or fowl in the temple courtyard, it is permitted to benefit from all the above. In other words, the specific, what's apparent is that the specific prohibition of Shechita is Shechita. But if you do something that is anyway the animal is considered non-kosher, then of course you're not eating it, but it would not be disqualified from benefiting from it. Now, halacha 3. This does not apply only to domesticated animals or beasts. Instead, it is forbidden to bring all ordinary food into the temple courtyard. So your sandwich that you took for lunch, you can't take the food into the temple courtyard. He says it includes even meat from a slaughtered animal, fruit, or bread. And if one transgresses and brings such food in, it is permitted to partake of this food as it was before. In other words, although you're not allowed to take it in, it doesn't disqualify it from you eating from it or benefiting from it, as would slaughtering an animal in that courtyard. All of the above concepts are part of the oral tradition. Whenever anyone slaughters in the temple courtyard or eats an olive-side portion of the meat of ordinary animals that were slaughtered in the temple courtyard, he is liable for stripes of rebellious conduct. What that means is as follows. We've spoken about there are times when a person would be liable to get lashes, malkot. That is when you transgress an explicit prohibition in the Torah. As we saw, the mitzvah that prohibits one from slaughtering an animal in the temple courtyard is actually, it's something we derive from the fact that it says you only holy things are slaughtered there. So because it's a law that is derived, and it's not a direct negative command, so mitzvot in that category that are not a direct negative command, we do not have a biblical punishment for it, the punishment of lashes. However, the sages have instituted, and this is something we've come across previously, what's called makot mardut, rebellious makot, that lashes that were given for rebellious conduct. That is a rabbinic a punishment, and that would be applied over here. Halacha 4. The following rule applies when a person says this animal is consecrated as a peace offering, but the fetus is carrying remains of an ordinary status. So this is an interesting situation. Remember, we actually learned this together, that if you shecht an animal and there's a viable fetus inside it, that fetus would be kosher. So now he has an interesting scenario. An animal is pregnant, and you say, this mom, I want to give as a korban, but the fetus within is not a korban. Now, obviously, you're going to have to bring the mom to the courtyard to shecht it. And now the fetus is alive. So although it was shechted in the courtyard, because it has no other way of being shechted, you can't. As he concludes, because you wouldn't be able to shecht this somewhere outside because it's obviously within the mom. So that fetus would be kosher on the mom's shechita, even though it was done inside the temple courtyard. Halacha 5. One should not slaughter into seas or rivers, lest an Allah says he is worshipping the water. That means you don't want to allow the blood to flow directly into the water because it looks like idolatrous practice. And it appears as if he's offering a sacrifice to the water. Nor should one slaughter into utensils filled with water, lest one says he's slaughtering into the form that appears in the water. Maybe you don't want someone to think that there's some type of reflection there that you are offering this to. Nor should he slaughter it into utensils or into a pit, for this is the way of idolaters. If one slaughters in the above manner, his slaughter is acceptable. Basically, what the Rambam is talking about, we don't do something that looks like you're doing something that is not kosher, not okay. And so ideally we don't do it, but if you did it, it does not invalidate the shechita would still be kosher. One may slaughter into murky water in which an image may not be seen. Similarly, one may slaughter outside a pit and allow the blood to flow and descend into a pit. One should not do this in a marketplace so as not to mimic the Gentiles. Indeed, if one slaughters into a pit in the marketplace, it's forbidden to eat from his slaughter until his character is examined, lest he's a heretic. Again, right, in the first halacha, we're assuming the guy's not doing it with idolatrous intent. He's just doing something that can be inferred to be idolatrous. So what we learn from this halacha is that you can, that when he says that you can do a second step away, like next to the pit or something, but not directly into a furrow, that's only in private, but not in public. Because then, and if you did do it in public, then you have to check the guy's character to find out if he is indeed, to be certain that he wasn't maybe slaughtering it for idolatrous reasons. It's permitted to slaughter on the wall of a ship, although the blood will flow down the wall and descend onto the water. Again, it's indirectly going into the water. Similarly, it is permitted to slaughter above the outer surface of utensils because it's not direct, it's indirect, and it will go in. How does one slaughter? So now we go to the actual action of the cutting action. And really what the rule is the cutting action has to be back and forth without applying direct pushing pressure, which we'll learn more about. You don't push the knife into the neck, but there has to be a back and forth smooth movement. And this is what we'll see different examples. He says, how does one slaughter? One extends the neck and passes the knife back and forth until the animal is slaughtered. When the animal is lying down, meaning that you bring the knife down on top of it, if the animal is lying on its back, or if it was standing and you bring it upwards. You held the knife in his hand below and saw that the slaughter is acceptable if it's a back and forth motion that goes cleanly through the neck and the two, what we call simanim, the two signs of the gullet and the windpipe. Now, if one implanted a knife in the wall, so I guess you're doing this on your own. You don't have someone to hold that with you. So you stick a knife in the wall. You got this knife, sharp blade. We spoke about the sharpness of the blade in the previous halacha. And now you bring the animal towards that knife and you move the animal back and forth over the blade. So what happens? So he says, the slaughter is acceptable, provided the neck of the animal is below the knife and isn't above it. So you got to place it close to the ground, push the animal back and forth next to the knife. Why? Because it's possible that the animal will descend with the weight of its body on the knife and cut its throat without being brought back and forth. In other words, if you don't have the slicing motion, but you have the pushing motion, which is not acceptable, we're concerned about that if the animal is coming from the top because of the weight of the animal. And that's not considered ritual slaughter, as we'll explain in chapter 3. Therefore, if we're speaking about a bird, whether its neck is above the knife or it is planted below, the slaughter is acceptable because there's not the concern of the weight. You can move the bird back and forth over the knife, which would mimic if had you actually moved the knife back and forth. Halacha, when a person slaughters and draws the knife forward, but does not draw it back, draws it back, but does not draw it forward, his slaughter is acceptable. We said the motion is back and forth, but what happens if you went out and you managed to cut through the majority of the windpipe and the gullet, or you stuck your hand outwards and you pulled it back and you managed to cut through the two simanim? That's also kosher. Fine, no problem. But if he drew the knife back and forth until he cut the head entirely, his slaughter is acceptable. In other words, what happens is if you went one way and back and you actually took the head of the animal off. So what's the concern? The concern is that you might think that you pushed through, right? Is it really possible to cut through the neck with a back and forth motion, or would you have to actually push through? So the Rambam is saying it is acceptable. But the following rule applies. If he drew the knife forward and not backwards, he only did one motion, and he cut off the head while drawing it forward alone or drawing it back alone. So if he did it in one motion and the head of the animal comes off, so he says, if the knife is twice as long as the width of the neck of the animal being slaughtered, then it is acceptable. But if not, his slaughter is not acceptable. Now, as a man, you got a very, very long knife. So if you pull it across the neck and it goes all the way through, fine. But if it's shorter than the width of the animal, or not twice as long as the width of the neck, then he says it's impossible that you would be able to cut off the neck simply with a sliding motion and not a pushing motion. The fact that you get through indicates that you've pushed through, which, as we will explain in chapter 3, and as we mentioned, is not kosher for Shechita. If one slaughters the head of two animals together, his slaughter is acceptable. Okay, so you have two animals back and forth, managed to cut both, fine, no problem. When two people hold onto a knife together, even one is holding one side and the other from the other side. So imagine like a saw, except it's a smooth blade, not a serrated blade. And they hold it and they go back and forth, acceptable. So if two people hold two knives separately and both slaughter simultaneously in two places in the neck, in other words, one's going for the gullet and one's going for the windpipe, but at different points in the neck, but they're doing it as long as they're doing it at the same time, it's acceptable. This applies even if the slit, the gullet alone, or its majority, only one of them cuts the gullet and one of them cuts the windpipe, or the majority of it, and even though if it's in two different places on the neck, it's still acceptable as long as they did it at the same time, even if it's not exactly the same place. He says, similarly, if one shecht in the form of a reed, that basically means at an angle, or if you shecht, he says like a comb, if there's a bit of a rigid, that's fine. As long as the actual cut is smooth, it doesn't matter the angle, or even if there's more than one angle to the cut. I'm not sure exactly how you do that, but you're talking about an extraordinary sharp blade, and it's possible that he may have gone like that, and it's still kosher, even though it's not a straight line. Halacha 11, the slaughter of ordinary animals does not require focused attention. Right? We're going to learn about korbanot, you actually have to have kavanah. What is the intention of this particular animal? What korban is it going to be? When does it need to be eaten, and so on and so forth. When you're shechting for an animal to eat it, you don't have to have intention that I'm shechting this in order that it will be kosher. It doesn't have to have that focused attention. So therefore, even if one slaughtered one wielding a knife aimlessly, so you had a knife in your hand and you walk up to the animal and you just go zhoo, zhoo, whatever, you're not intending, but the actual cut is done within the framework of what a kosher cut would be. Or if he does it in jest, or even if he threw a knife to implant it in the wall and it cut the animal's neck in one slice as it needs to be for shechita, since it's slaughtered properly in an appropriate place and with appropriate measure, meaning it went through the majority of both the gullet and the windpipe, then it is acceptable. That he's just making the point that you don't have specific intention when you are shechting. Accordingly, and based on this then, what we'll see is pretty much anybody can shech, any Jewish person can shech. He says when a deaf mute or an emotional or an intellectual unstable individual or a minor or a drunk whose mind is befuddled or person who became overtaken by an evil spirit, if any of these slaughtered and others observe that he slaughters in the correct manner, the slaughter is acceptable. Because in many mitzvahs, these people are not responsible for because it requires intention or maturity or an understanding. The point of here is that the slaughter, just the act has to be done in the precise way. If the person does it in the precise way, even if their mind is not with them, so in other words, somebody watches them do it, it would still be kosher. If by contrast, a knife falls, so it wasn't initiated by human effort, and it slaughters an animal in its way, that's not acceptable. Even if it slaughtered it in the appropriate manner, because the pasuk says, you shall slaughter, v'zavachta, implying that a man must slaughter, his actions are acceptable, even if he does not intend to slaughter. But if it just happened on its own, a knife falls or something, or an animal walks past a blade, that's not shechita. Following applies if there is a stone or a wooden wheel with a knife affixed to it. So this is some type of contraption where you would turn something and you would cause a knife to move back and forward. So if a person turned the wheel and placed the neck of a bird or an animal opposite it, and the knife goes and cuts it, that's acceptable. Again, because even though the human being is not touching the knife, but it's the human power that is powering the knife, that's fine. He said that if water is turning the wheel, so if you had like they would have windmills if you're getting the power from the water, so this is somehow it's a contraption that has it's got a spinning wheel that causes the knife to go back and forward. So if it's the water, the power of the water that's turning it, that's no good because that's not human effort. He says, if a person causes the water to flow until they turn the wheel and causes slaughter by turning it, the slaughter is acceptable. Notice if there was a dam and a person removes the dam wall and the first gush of water is what causes the wheel to turn, and the immediate action of the knife that's turning slaughters an animal, that would be fine because that is considered the direct result of human effort. But that would only be with regard to the first turn, right? The first time the wheel turns and the knife cuts, because that came from the effort of the person that allowed the water to gush forward. But the second turns that is no longer considered, it's now just the perpetual motion of the water. It's not considered human effort, and that would not be acceptable. Halacha 40, when a person slaughters for the sake of mountains, hills, seas, rivers, or deserts. So here we're talking about, we're not talking about somebody who's actually worships these things, but again, it's like he's doing something that is similar to idolatrous practice. He said, I'm shechting it. Why is he shechting it? Because he needs to eat tonight. Does he worship the hills and the mountains? No, he doesn't. But when he slaughters, he says that he's doing it. Then it becomes unacceptable. In other words, although you don't need intention, but if you assert a negative intention, or what this would be considered negative intention, that's a problem. Even when he does not intend to worship these entities. Now, even when he's not doing it as a sign of worship, he just, I don't know, he thinks it sounds great, But merely for curative purposes or the like, according to the empty words related by the Gentiles, this slaughter is unacceptable. If everyone slaughtered for the sake of the spiritual source of the sea, the mountain, the stars, constellations of the like, then it is forbidden to benefit from the animal, like all offerings brought by false deities. See, in the first instance, you can't eat it, but you can benefit from it. But if as soon as he says, I'm slaughtering this for the heavenly entities, spiritual sources, even though he's not an idolater, that already is too close to idol worship, and that would make it unfit even for benefit, not just not allowed to eat it, but unfit for benefit as well. Halacha 15, when a person slaughters an animal with the intent of sprinkling its blood for the sake of false deities, or burns its fat for the sake of false deities. So he's not intending that the shechita, the slaughter, is an offering to false gods, but he thinks that the blood that I'll take from us, I'm going to sprinkle to idolatry. Forbidden. Okay, that means you're not even going to have benefit from it. For we derive the laws governing one's intent outside the temple with regard to slaughtering ordinary animals from those pertaining to the intent with regard to slaughtering consecrated animals within the temple. So we're going to learn about specific laws of kavanah when you are shechting animals for korbanot, and those things that would disqualify an animal for an offering will also disqualify it for your personal use if you are shechting an ordinary animal. And for such an intent disqualifies them, as we'll explain in Hilchot Pesudei Mikdash, being that not just the intention of the slaughter can't be for idolatrous purpose, but even the intention of what you might do with the blood cannot be for idolatrous purposes, as we learn by those things that are unfit for holy offerings. It would apply here as well. That intention would invalidate it for you. Halacha 60, when a person slaughters an animal and afterwards thought to sprinkle its blood for the sake of false deities or to burn its fat for the sake of false deities, in other words, he didn't have the intention while he was cutting it. He shechted the animal. He's got the blood now on the floor. He says, I think I'm going to take this and sprinkle it to the idolaters, to an idol. So we say then the meat is forbidden because of a doubt involved. Perhaps the ultimate result showed what his initial intention was, and when he intended to slaughter it, and therefore that would invalidate it. The shechita, you can't eat that animal. Halacha 17, when a person slaughters an animal for the sake of a type of sacrifice for which one could consecrate an animal through a vow or through a pledge, the slaughter is unacceptable. So see, here's the thing. In the Beit HaMikdash, there were different types of korbanot. There were certain things which you could bring voluntarily, and then there were those types of korbanot which you were obligated to bring. Okay? Now, you're not allowed to shecht any type of animal that is being consecrated to the temple outside of the temple. So what happens is a guy's got his cow in the backyard and he's shechting it for lunch, but he says, I'm shechting it as a korban. So now what we're going to see is, it depends what, in other words, he's not really shechting it for a korban, but he says he is. So if it's the type of korban that he can voluntarily bring, it will be unacceptable. If it's a type of korban that he cannot voluntarily bring, or he's not obligated to bring, it doesn't affect it, because it's obvious then that this is just simply like jest. You're following? If it's something that he could theoretically be offering, then it disqualifies this shechita, even though he wasn't actually intending to do it. But if it's something that he cannot actually just bring voluntarily, it will not disqualify this shechita, because it becomes obvious that when he says, I'm shechting this, we'll go into some examples. He says, I'm shechting this korban Pesach, or similar, that the korban Pesach actually would be a problem, but others that he can't just bring voluntarily, but he would be obligated to him, clearly that he doesn't have that obligation now, it wouldn't invalidate that shechita. Okay, so the Rambam actually speaks this out. Let's look at halacha 18. What's implied? When one slaughters an animal for the sake of a burnt offering, for the sake of a peace offering, for the sake of a thanksgiving offering, or for the sake of a paschal offering, the slaughter is unacceptable. Okay, because these are things that he can voluntarily bring. Now, obviously, Pesach offering, you only bring once a year, but the point of with the Pesach offering is that you can set aside the animal any time of year. And since it's something that you could do at any other time of year, and it is for a person to put forward, that shechting is unacceptable. Since a Paschal offering may be designated every year at any time one desires, it resembles a sacrifice that can be consecrated through a vow or through a pledge. But if one slaughters an animal for the sake of a sin offering, now sin offering is an obligation on you, for the sake of a certain guilt offering, for the sake of a doubtful guilt offering, for the sake of a firstborn offering. You only bring a firstborn offering if there's a firstborn, right? For the sake of a tithe offering, or for the sake of a substitute for any offering, the slaughter is acceptable. And again, because it's clear then that it's kind of like, it's a nonsensical statement that he's saying. When a person is liable for a sin offering and he slaughters, say, for the sake of my sin offering, his slaughter is unacceptable. So that's right. So the previous halacha, he says like this: if someone is known not to have sinned, or not known to have sinned for any reason, he's not liable for a sin offering. He just says, I'm shechting this as a sin offering. It's of no concern. But if we know he's liable for a sin offering now, and then he goes into his backyard and says, I'm shechting this for a sin offering, then it would be a problem. It would be a problem. Because he's saying for the sin of my sin offering. If he had a sacrificial animal in his house and now another case. If he had a sacrificial animal in his home and he slaughtered, saying, for the sake of a substitute for my sacrifice, his slaughter is unacceptable for a substitute an animal. He substituted the animal for the consecrated one. So this is an interesting halakha. Basically, he has one cow that he set aside that he's going to take up to the temple for an offering. He has another cow, and he goes over to the other cow and he says, I'm slaughtering this as a substitute for the other one. That's problematic because the halacha is once you substitute a regular animal for a holy animal, they actually both end up being holy. And that's what the Rambam is saying here, is that as soon as he says that, it makes it unacceptable, because then he's shechting something that should otherwise be holy in an outside of the temple. Halacha 20, when a woman slaughters for the sake of the burnt offering brought by a woman who gave birth, saying, this is for the sake of my burnt offering, her slaughter is acceptable. Remember, a woman can shech. And if she shechts for the sake of the burnt offering of another woman, it's acceptable. The rationale, in other words, because the rationale is that the obligation to bring the burnt offering of a woman who gave birth cannot be initiated through a vow or through a pledge, and this woman has not given birth, and is not obligated to bring a burnt offering. So we do not suspect that she had and we don't suspect that she had a miscarriage, for it will become public knowledge if a woman miscarries. Again, this is another situation where there's an obligation to give a sacrifice after birth becomes obligated after birth. So if a woman who hasn't given birth says, I'm shechting this as a birth offering, right? Again, it's like a nonsensical statement because there's no obligation. And we don't suspect, this is the point that I makes, that maybe she had a miscarriage. And there are sometimes, depending on the duration of the gestation or how far she is, that she may have to bring a korban. We don't suspect that she had a miscarriage if we don't know about it, because we would assume that a miscarriage is something that actually people find out about. Where my contrast abortion slaughters for the sake of a burnt offering brought by a Nazarite, his slaughter is unacceptable, even if he's not a Nazarite. And here the rationale is that the fundamental dimension of being a Nazarite is a vow like other vows. And basically, maybe this guy actually took it upon himself the vow of Nazarite that we weren't yet aware of. And therefore, it's something that you can voluntarily do. So if you're outside of the Beis HaMikdash and you say, I'm shechting this as an oila, as an offering of the Nazarite, then that is problematic. Halacha 21, two people hold a knife and slaughter. One has in mind an intent that would disqualify the slaughter, and the other has nothing at all in mind. So all these examples that we spoke about earlier, we said you never have to have an intention. But if you had a negative intention, it would affect it. So one of them has it. Or even if you had in mind an intent that is permitted, the slaughter is unacceptable. So long as one of them is off, it makes the whole animal no good. Similarly, if they slaughter one after the other, and one in an intent that disqualifies the slaughter, it is disqualified. One after the other means like literally it would have to be one motion moving into the next. But even so, if one of them is critical to the Shechita and their intention is off, it would disqualify. When does the Vav apply? When the person with the undesirable intent has a share in the animal. If he does not have a share in the animal, it does not become forbidden. For a Jewish person does not cause something that does not belong to him to be forbidden. He's acting only to cause his colleague anguish. In other words, that's what we say. So when the two people do both have a share in the animal, if it's a person next to me that doesn't actually own this animal, and he has a negative intent, that won't now affect my animal. And halacha 22, when a Jew slaughters for a non-Jew, the slaughter is acceptable regardless of the thoughts that the Gentile has in his mind. Because even though the Gentile is the owner, and in the previous halacha we learned, it seems to imply that the owner's intent is more important than a person that doesn't own it. But that's so long as they're actually participating in the Shechita. But if a Jew is shechting and a non-Jew owns it, and he has whatever intent he has, that doesn't matter. For we are concerned only with the thoughts of the person who's actually slaughtering and not the thoughts of the owner of the animal. The emphasis is not on the owner, but the emphasis on the people that are actually shechting. Therefore, when a Gentile, even a minor, slaughters for the sake of a Jew, the animal slaughtered is an avela, as we'll explain, that is not kosher. So although Shechita, any type of Jew, even those who are incapable of intention and real awareness, would be kosher, so long as the act is done precisely and correctly. A non-Jew's shechting would not be kosher. And it's what we call an avela, something that is unfit for kosher consumption. Okay, so that brings us to the end of chapter 2 of the